Welcome back to the Grail Standard. I'm your host, Sir Vane. Today we're doing something important because this is one of those topics that keeps coming back in history, and it keeps coming back in modern politics, and it keeps coming back in modern life. And it's this idea that we should sacrifice liberty for security. There's a famous quote that gets thrown around for this. People usually shorten it to, "Those who sacrifice liberty in the name of security deserve neither." But the fuller version, the one Benjamin Franklin actually wrote, is, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Now, I'm not doing this to turn this into a history lesson about Franklin. I'm doing it because that quote points to something deeper. There are moral systems that will happily justify sacrificing people's rights for the greater good, and there are moral systems that refuse to do that even in a crisis. And that's where virtue ethics comes in. So let's start with the basics. Utilitarianism, real utilitarianism, is an ethical framework that says an action is morally right if it produces the greatest overall good or the greatest overall reduction in suffering. So it's an outcome-based morality. And yes, that's why people associate it with the ends justify the means. Because if the outcomes are what matter most, then morally ugly methods can be justified if the result is good enough. But here's the part that gets ignored. Real utilitarianism is not supposed to be propaganda. It's supposed to involve honest assessment of harms and benefits, a real concern for human suffering, and a willingness to change course when your policy increases suffering instead of reducing it. That's not how despots use it. Despots use the language of utilitarianism as a weapon, not a moral discipline. So virtue ethics doesn't begin with outcomes, it begins with character. It asks, what kind of person must I become to live rightly? And what kind of society is produced when leaders have certain virtues or certain vices? Virtue ethics is not naive. It understands crises, it understands danger, but it insists on something that utilitarian thinking often weakens: moral limits. A virtue ethical approach says, some acts are corrupting regardless of outcome. Some shortcuts deform the soul. Some methods destroy legitimacy, even if they work. That's why virtue ethics is so aligned with chivalry, because chivalry is not just win the war. Chivalry is win without becoming the thing you hate. And that's why the Franklin quote hits so hard, because it's only saying you might lose liberty. Because it is only saying you might lose liberty. It's warning that when you trade away essential liberty for temporary security, you often end up losing both. Not because the universe is poetic, but because you have empowered a system that no longer needs your consent. Now, we get to the key part of the episode, which is how do we differentiate real utilitarianism from the way totalitarians justify totalitarianism? Here's the pattern. A despot says there is an existential threat. Ordinary rights are a luxury. Exceptional powers are necessary. Opposition proves disloyalty. Sacrifice now will bring peace later. And the danger is that entire chain sounds outcome-based and reasonable, especially when people are afraid. But here's the test. Real utilitarian ethics must remain accountable to outcomes and to human suffering. Totalitarian security morality does the opposite. It suppresses evidence of failure, it treats dissent as sabotage, it expands coercion when harm increases, it defines the good in ideological terms, and it exempts the ruling class from the costs. So what you end up with isn't the greatest good, you end up with a machine that feeds itself. And this is where virtue ethics says, no. That path is corruption. Because even if you gain security, you gained it through injustice, and you've trained the state to do injustice as routine. This is where the Captain America book fits beautifully. In Virtue Ethics of Captain America 2nd edition, Mark D. White opens with a chapter that literally frames Captain America through the main ethical systems, including utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And later the book has a chapter explicitly about patriotism, fascism, and the dream, which is exactly the territory we're discussing when we talk about security being used to justify authoritarian control. Now, why does Captain America matter here? Because Captain America, when written properly, embodies the virtue ethical refusal to cash moral blank checks. He's the kind of hero who says, I'm not against safety, I'm against safety bought through injustice. He's not anti-order, he's anti-order without moral grounding. And that's why his best stories always collide with this question. What happens when the law demands what conscience cannot allow? That's not an outcomes question, that's a virtue question. Because the virtue ethicist says, if you become a tyrant to defeat tyranny, you have already lost. And that's a Grail Standard idea. That's Arthurian. It's the idea that legitimacy rests on character. Now let's bring it back to the quote, those who give up essential liberty to purchase a little's temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Virtue ethics hears that and says, if you cultivate fear as your ruling principle, you will become a fearful society. If you cultivate coercion as your governing tool, coercion will spread. If you cultivate obedience without virtue, you will get compliance without justice. And the real punchline is, when you give the state the power to violate rights temporarily, you are betting on the virtue of people who are not selected for virtue. That's the whole point. Virtue ethics is a realism about the soul. It assumes vice is always waiting to exploit loopholes, which is why virtue ethics insists limits, restraint, honor, and accountability. Not because we hate security, but because we understand how power behaves when it isn't restrained by character. So here's the clean takeaway. Utilitarianism, honestly practiced, is an attempt to reduce suffering by focusing on outcomes. But it can become a moral trap when it's used to justify necessary injustice. Virtue ethics rejects that trap. It says, some means are not permitted because they corrupt the actor. They corrupt institutions and they destroy legitimacy. And that's why Captain America resonates so strongly. Because he is a modern story about an ancient truth. A society can survive danger, but it cannot survive moral collapse. Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who thinks security is always a good excuse. And until next time, keep your courage disciplined, your strength restrained, and your honor intact. I'm Sir Yvain, and this has been the Grail Standard.